Grosse Île lies 50 kilometers east of Quebec City, one of 21 islands in the middle of the St. Lawrence River. Though its name means big island in French, Grosse Île is barely 2 kilometers square, home to a small collection of buildings from its days as a quarantine station for Irish immigrants arriving in Canada. Designated a National Historic Site in 1974, today the island is open to tourists and hosts a museum, guided walking tours, and other activities. Yet this seemingly idyllic little island holds a dark secret. During the Second World War, a team of Canadian scientists used Grosse Île as a secret laboratory to study and weaponize some of the deadliest diseases known to mankind. Biological weapons which, if used, could have unleashed a bacteriological apocalypse. Now, when one thinks of weapons of mass destruction, one is unlikely to think of Canada, yet in the build-up to the Second World War, Canada was among the first Western nations to push for the development of chemical and biological warfare. And the unlikely champion of this initiative was a man more associated with saving millions of lives than ending them, Sir Frederick Banting. In 1923, Banting was awarded the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine for the discovery of insulin, used in the treatment of diabetes. Warily observing the rise of Nazism and Europe's steady march towards war, in the late 1930s, Banting became gravely concerned about Germany's potential use of chemical and germ warfare in the coming conflict. Germany had pioneered chemical warfare during the First World War, first deploying chlorine gas against Canadian and French troops at the Battle of Ypres in April 1915, and its microbiologists were among the finest in the world. Around 1.3 million casualties, including 90,000 deaths, were inflicted by poison gas during the conflict. Newer, more potent gases developed since then had the potential to kill millions more, and biological weapons even more than that. Just before we continue, quick word from our fantastic sponsor, Squarespace. You know that project or business idea that you've been sitting on the one that is, I should start that someday. Well, someday should be today with Squarespace. Squarespace gives you everything you need to build a website that actually stands out. They've got stunning, customizable templates. They've got built-in SEO tools to help people find your website. They've even got options to sell courses or memberships, so it's never been easier to turn an idea that you've had into something real. There's no coding, there's no hassle. You just get a website that looks great and works. You could do it in an afternoon. So start your free trial today at squarespace.com/brainfood. And when you're ready to launch, use the code BRAINFOOD to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. And now back to today's episode. So obsessed was Banting with halting the Nazi war machine that in 1939 he wrote in his diary, "We need to kill 2 or 4 million young Germans without mercy, without feeling. It is our duty to eliminate them." The Nazis in him would have apparently gotten on great if he'd been German instead of Canadian. In any event, soon after Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939, Banting met with senior government officials and convinced them to back a more intensive chemical and biological weapons program. Limited research on bacteriological warfare agents was already underway in Canadian universities since 1937, but these programs were severely underfunded. Turning to the private sector, Banting managed to secure $500,000, an unprecedented amount in those days, from Samuel Bronfman, head of Seagram's distillery, and John David Eaton, owner of Eaton's department stores. With this infusion of cash, bioweapons research in Canada kicked into high gear, and a special body known as the M1000 Committee was formed to direct it. But Banting would not live to see the fruits of his initiative, dying in a plane crash in Newfoundland in February 1941 while flying to meet with British biological weapons experts. In December 1941, the project took on a new urgency as Japan entered the war on the side of the Axis. Japan was even more advanced in its use of biological warfare, having established the infamous Unit 731 in occupied Manchuria to test biological weapons on live Chinese POWs and civilians, the test subjects often being dissected alive without anesthesia. The Japanese also deployed anthrax, cholera, and bubonic plague against Chinese villagers, killing over 400,000 civilians. The M1000 Committee considered dozens of potential bacteriological warfare agents for development, including bubonic plague, typhus, tularemia, psittacosis, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, botulism, salmonella, glanders, and African horse sickness. But early on, 2 clear frontrunners emerged: rinderpest, a disease mainly affecting cattle, and anthrax. Anthrax was particularly well suited to biological warfare as it formed hard, resilient spores which could resist extremely high temperatures. This allowed anthrax spores to be packed into air-dropped bombs and dispersed using explosives. As an added bonus, anthrax was treatable using penicillin, which, unlike the Germans, the Allies would soon have in great supply. In 1942, the war was going badly for the Allies. The British Army was shut out of mainland Europe. U-boats were sinking hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping off the coast of the US. The Eighth Army was being pushed out of North Africa, and German forces were advancing ever deeper into the Soviet Union. About the only weapons the Allies had to strike back against the Axis were the bombers of the Royal Air Force, and to maximize their destructive power, the British began planning a massive biological warfare campaign against Nazi Germany. Codenamed Operation Vegetarian, the plan called for RAF bombers to drop millions of anthrax-infected feed cakes across Germany. They would be eaten by cattle and other livestock, contaminating their meat and causing widespread disease and famine. The resulting disruption of civilian life was expected to cause Nazi Germany to collapse within months. Now, to test this weapon, scientists at the Biological Warfare Centre at Portendown acquired the remote island of Grenade in northern Scotland. A flock of sheep was transported to the island, and various designs of anthrax bombs and anthrax cake dispensers were exploded among them. The effects were chilling. Within 3 days, every single sheep was dead. The contaminated corpses were buried by piling them under a cliff and dynamiting the cliff on top of them. But a single corpse managed to float away and washed ashore on the mainland. This touched off an anthrax outbreak that killed over 100 livestock and pets. Thankfully, the Portendown scientists were able to contain that outbreak before it spread to the human population, though due to wartime secrecy, it would be decades before the locals discovered what had killed their animals. But Grenade Island was found to be hopelessly contaminated, and after disinfecting the soil as best they could with fire and formaldehyde, the scientists suspended all further experiments and sealed off the island indefinitely. The Grenade Island incident convinced the government that it was too dangerous to manufacture and test biological weapons on British soil. For an alternative site, they turned to their colony across the Atlantic. It would not be the first or last time Britain looked to Canada to help test dangerous weapons. Following a series of experiments at Portendown where British soldiers were exposed to mustard gas, Britain ordered all further testing moved to Suffield, a Canadian military base in Alberta. Here in 1942, 712 volunteer Canadian soldiers were marched out onto the proving grounds wearing only gas masks and regular combat gear and ordered to stand at attention while an aircraft flying at 1,000 feet sprayed them with mustard gas. Once the gas had fully penetrated their clothing, they were marched back to base and the effects studied. Mustard gas is a vesicant or blister agent, which, when absorbed by the skin, inflicts severe, extremely painful chemical burns that can take months to heal. Participants were paid $1 for volunteering and $20 each for each burn that appeared, though given the horrific effects, it is debatable whether these rewards were worth it. Similar experiments were later carried out on troops in Innisfail, Australia, and Karachi, British India, making Britain and her empire the only belligerent nation other than Japan to test chemical weapons on human subjects during World War II. Incredibly, in 1950, Canada would offer to allow Britain to test its first atomic bomb in the Canadian north near the town of Churchill, an offer Britain declined in favour of Australia. Meanwhile, in the months following Sir Frederick Banting's death, biological weapons research in Canada began to languish. Then, in October 1941, US Secretary of War Henry Simpson sent a letter to President Franklin Roosevelt urging the creation of a US bioweapons program. Due to the more advanced state of the Canadian program, an agreement was reached whereby the US would bankroll Canadian development of bioweapons until their own development center at Fort Detrick, Maryland was up and running. This coincided almost perfectly with the British request for an alternate weapons development center, and with $200,000 of US government funds in hand, the project directors E.G.D. Murray and Otto Maas began searching for a suitable site for a secret bioweapons lab. They quickly found one in the former quarantine station of Grosse Île, a place with an already dark and tragic past. Grosse Île Station was established in 1832, replacing the older Point Levy station. And just in time too, for in the late 1840s, Canada was inundated with hundreds of thousands of Irish immigrants fleeing the potato famine. Many of these immigrants arrived aboard so-called coffin ships, lumber freighters offering cheap transatlantic passage, and the crowded unsanitary conditions in their holds led to frequent outbreaks of disease like typhus and cholera. In 1847 alone, more than 100,000 people arrived in Quebec, with up to 40 ships lining up for 3 kilometers along the river waiting to unload their cargoes. This massive influx quickly overwhelmed the island's limited facilities. Its hospitals were soon filled to bursting, forcing many of the sick to fend for themselves in the mud outside. Eventually, 22 150-foot-long fever sheds were built on the mainland to accommodate the overflow, but this led to disease spreading to the rest of the city. When the local population rioted, threatening to push the sheds into the river, the military were forced to cordon off the area. It would not be until 1854 that improved sanitation and a reduction in immigration finally brought an end to the epidemics. Between 1832 and 1932, around 500,000 immigrants entered Canada via Grosse Île, making it, along with Pier 21 in Halifax, the Canadian analogue of Ellis Island in New York. Of these new arrivals, around 5,000 died of disease, their bodies buried in mass graves on the island itself and on nearby Point Charles. The island was an ideal site for bacteriological research for several reasons. First, it was remote and relatively inaccessible, the closest population centre being the small village of Montmagny just across the river. Second, it was entirely self-sufficient with its own working power plants, boilers, dormitories, churches and hospitals. But most attractive of all was the Decontamination building, which featured a pair of massive steam-powered sterilisation chambers. Immigrants arriving on Grosse Île were required to remove their clothes and place them in the ovens before proceeding to the showers, on the other side of which they would collect their newly lice and flea-free clothes. These chambers, thought Murray and Mass, would be ideal for growing large quantities of anthrax. But some were not so sure. Charles Mitchell, Canada's chief veterinarian, objected that the island wasn't isolated enough, being only 6 kilometres from the nearest riverbank. To be sufficiently safe, he argued, the site would have to be at least 80 kilometres offshore. But as no alternative site could be found, Mitchell was overruled, and in 1942, the Grosse Île Laboratory commenced operation under the cover of the name the War Diseases Control Station. The island, under the command of Major Richard Duthie and guarded by a garrison of 100 soldiers, was divided into 2 main areas. The west of the island was occupied by Project R, studying rinderpest, and the east end by Project N, studying anthrax. Anthrax was grown in flat trays in the 2 decontamination ovens, which, for safety reasons, were kept locked shut with the scientists inside. Many scientists found working in the ovens in full protective gear unbearable, leading many to adopt the curious practice of working naked, except for a gas mask. This practice also had the added benefit of making their bodies easier to decontaminate. But even measures such as these soon proved grossly inadequate. In an early report on Grosse Île's operations, Major Duthie complained that the island was infested with flies, which could easily land on lab equipment and carry deadly spores to the mainland. Then, in August 1943, several scientists came down with mysterious illnesses and had to be isolated at a hospital in Quebec City. Tests later confirmed that they were infected with anthrax. The incident raised alarm bells among the project directors, many of whom called for the island laboratory to be shut down. But they were ultimately overruled for political reasons, as many in the project wanted to prove that Canadian scientists were every bit as good as their American counterparts. And there were other dangers to worry about. In the fall of 1943, German U-boats began penetrating deeper and deeper into the St. Lawrence estuary, raising fears that they would discover the Grosse Île station. Isolation also began to take its toll. Due to the top-secret nature of the project, the island garrison was unable to bring their families along. Bored and restless, they acted abysmally while on leave in neighbouring Montmagny. This led to concerns about the island's secrets leaking out, though by this time the residents of Montmagny already suspected something was amiss and began avoiding the island's staff like, well, the plague. Yet, despite these difficulties, anthrax production forged ahead, and by the end of 1943, Grosse Île was producing 120 kilos of anthrax spores every week, enough to fill 1,500 standard aerial bombs. In August 1944, these bombs were extensively tested at the Suffield Proving Grounds, despite the fact that, unlike Grenade Island, Suffield had no natural geographic barriers to prevent deadly spores from drifting into populated areas. The extent of the site's contamination remains classified to this day, a somewhat alarming fact given that anthrax spores can survive in the soil for up to 100 years. In any case, the British were impressed with the results and ordered 500,000 anthrax bombs from Suffield and Grosse Île. But while the scientists perfected their deadly creations, Allied leaders dithered on how or whether to use them. Despite the Grenade fiasco, planning for Operation Vegetarian continued, though it was only to be carried out in retaliation for a German anthrax attack on Britain. Then, on the eve of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Europe in 1944, a new plan was proposed to drop anthrax and rinderpest onto the German cities of Aix-la-Chapelle, Wilhelmshaven, Stuttgart, Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Berlin. But this was shelved for fear of reprisals and reserved only as a retaliatory measure. At the same time, Allied intelligence began to learn of 2 advanced secret weapons being developed by the Germans, the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 ballistic missile. Both had the range to reach London from launch sites in occupied France and the Netherlands, but only had an accuracy of 8 kilometres and a payload of 1 ton. This would make an explosive or chemical warhead all but useless, leaving only one possible payload, a biological weapon. In response, Allied scientists began producing large quantities of botulinum toxin, better known as Botox, a poison so potent that 1 gram can kill 1 million people. As with anthrax, this choice was predicated on the fact that the Allies had a Botox antidote and the Germans did not. But in the end, all these plans came to nothing, as attacks using conventional weapons finally forced Nazi Germany to surrender on May 8, 1945. And when the conquering armies inspected Nazi battle preparations, they were shocked by what they found. Despite Allied fears, in reality, Germany had no biological weapons to speak of. And while German scientists had developed the deadly nerve gases sarin and tabun, military leaders adopted not to use them for fear of Allied reprisals. Even the vaunted V weapons carried only high explosives and not biological warheads, as many had feared. For all the paranoia which had driven the Allied WMD programs, even the Nazis found the prospect of chemical and biological warfare too terrible to contemplate. But even if the Allies had opted to use biological weapons, Canada would only have been a small part of the overall effort. Of the 500,000 bombs ordered by Britain, only 5,000 were produced by Grosse Île and Suffield by the war's end. Still, this alone accounted for 439 litres of spores, or 70 billion lethal doses, enough to kill the world population at the time 30 times over. But by 1944, anthrax production at Fort Detrick was in full swing and quickly eclipsed the Canadian facilities, causing the United States to break off its partnership with Canada. Research at Grosse Île continued until 1956, when the station was finally shut down and decommissioned. In 1957, it became a veterinary research centre, while in 1965 it was once again used as a quarantine station, though this time for imported animals. But the story doesn't quite end there. On March 24, 1970, George Ignatieff, ambassador to the United Nations Conference of the Committee on Disarmament, delivered a speech in which he claimed Canada never has and does not now possess any biological weapons or toxins. It was a bold-faced lie, as declassified government documents would reveal just 2 years later. While the Canadian government's official story was that chemical and biological weapons research had ended with the Second World War, in reality it had quietly continued for decades afterwards. In 1951 and 1952, extensive tests with sarin nerve gas were conducted at Suffield, while between 1962 and 1973, Canada participated in Project 112, a US Department of Defense program wherein simulated biological agents were sprayed over American and Canadian cities. Meanwhile, Suffield amassed massive stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, including 637 tons of mustard gas, 30 tons of sarin and VX nerve gas, 200 tons of phosgene, 2,800 pounds of botulinum toxin, and 200 pounds of ricin, the majority of which was not disposed of until 1989. 1974 brought to light another dangerous legacy of Canada's biowarfare project. In that year, the federal government, unaware of the island's secret wartime role, designated Grosse Île a National Historic Site and began developing it for tourism. In 1988, after thousands of tourists had already visited the island, the story of its use as an anthrax factory finally broke. And while scientists working at the station in 1956 claimed to have thoroughly decontaminated the island with formaldehyde, no records could be found confirming this. Worse still, some sources indicate that anthrax growing trays had simply been tossed into the St. Lawrence or even into the bushes, meaning that the entire island might be contaminated with deadly spores. Acting quickly, the government closed the site and passed it over to Environment Canada, who thoroughly decontaminated the site before handing it back to Parks Canada. That said, to this day, no person is known to have contracted anthrax from visiting the island. Many of the details of Grosse Île and Canada's bioweapons program may never be known, for most of the archival records were accidentally lost in the early 1990s. But what is known remains a dark and disturbing chapter in Canada's history, one that runs counter to the popular image of that nation. But it is perhaps a cause for hope, for despite the cruelty and depravity that characterized the deadliest conflict in modern history, most of the belligerent nations were wise enough to know that biological warfare was a horror too far, even for a group like the Nazis.